Episode 1: Issues and Topics. Q1: What do you do when a controversial issue comes up in a group conversation? I try to slow the conversation down rather than let it turn into people just repeating positions louder. A genuinely controversial issue rarely has one obvious right answer, so I'd rather understand why people disagree than win the exchange outright. Q2: How do you find the core issue when a problem seems to have many layers? I keep asking why until the answers stop changing. Usually the core issue is hiding 2 or 3 layers beneath the first complaint someone makes, and if you only fix the surface, the same problem tends to resurface later in a different form. Q3: Do you think every ethical issue has a clear right answer, or is it usually more complicated? Almost always more complicated, honestly. An ethical issue often involves 2 reasonable values pulling in opposite directions, not a clean choice between right and wrong. I've learned to be suspicious of anyone who makes it sound too simple. Q4: How aware are you of global issues that don't directly affect your daily life? Fairly aware, though I'll admit my attention shifts depending on what's in the news. I try to stay informed about a global issue even when it feels distant, because ignoring something just because it's not local usually catches up eventually. Q5: What's a practical issue you've had to deal with recently that seemed small but wasn't? A scheduling conflict. Actually, it seemed like a minor practical issue at first, but it ended up revealing a much bigger gap in how our team coordinated across time zones. Q6: When someone raises a technical issue mid-conversation, how do you keep the discussion accessible to everyone? I ask them to pause and explain it in plain terms before going further. A technical issue raised without context tends to lose half the room instantly, even if the point itself is genuinely important. Q7: Is it always worth trying to discuss a topic that people clearly disagree strongly on? Usually yes, carefully. I'd rather discuss a topic openly, even an uncomfortable one, than let unspoken tension sit under the surface. Avoiding it doesn't make the disagreement disappear, it just delays it. Q8: What's your approach when you have to deal with an issue that involves conflicting priorities? I try to name the trade-off explicitly rather than pretend both sides can fully win. When you deal with an issue like that honestly, at least everyone understands what's actually being sacrificed, even if they don't love the decision. Q9: Is it appropriate to raise an issue publicly, or should it always go through private channels first? It depends on how urgent and how personal it is. For most things, I'd raise an issue privately first, out of respect, and only bring it into a wider conversation if that private approach genuinely doesn't work. Q10: How do you connect a related topic into a conversation without derailing it? Carefully, and only if it actually adds something. Bringing up a related topic can enrich a discussion, but I try to check whether it's genuinely relevant or just something I personally find interesting. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 2: Arguments and Evidence. Q1: What makes someone able to make an argument convincingly without sounding aggressive? Calm confidence, mostly stating the point clearly once rather than repeating it louder. People who make an argument well tend to leave room for the other person to respond, rather than trying to win by volume. Q2: How much evidence is enough to support an argument confidently? Enough that a reasonable skeptic would have to take it seriously, honestly, not necessarily overwhelming proof. To genuinely support an argument, I try to find the strongest single piece of evidence rather than piling up 10 weak ones. Q3: What does having ample evidence for a claim actually look like in practice? It usually means the claim would survive someone actively trying to disprove it. Ample evidence isn't just a big pile of data, it's data that holds up even when you specifically look for the weak points. Q4: How important is it to provide evidence immediately versus building up to it? I usually lead with it, actually. If you wait too long to provide evidence, people form an opinion based on your tone alone, and by the time the facts arrive, they've already half made up their mind. Q5: What counts as sufficient evidence before you're comfortable changing your own opinion on something? Honestly, less than people assume. I try to stay genuinely open. Once there's sufficient evidence pointing a different direction, I'd rather update my view than defend a position just because I held it first. Q6. How do you explain a basic concept to someone without oversimplifying it into something misleading? I try to keep the core logic intact even while cutting detail. A basic concept explained badly can create a wrong mental model that's actually harder to unlearn later than just staying confused. Q7. Why does a precise definition matter so much in a disagreement? Because half of all arguments, honestly, come from two people using the same word to mean different things. Getting a precise definition on the table early often dissolves a disagreement that looked much bigger than it actually was. Q8. When is a theoretical framework more useful than just looking at raw examples? When you need to generalize beyond a single case. A theoretical framework helps you see why something works, not just that it worked once, which matters if you want the insight to apply somewhere new. Q9. How do you build a detailed analysis without losing the reader in unnecessary complexity? I structure it in layers, a short summary first, then a detailed analysis underneath for anyone who wants to go deeper. That way people aren't forced through the depth if they only need the headline. Q10. Is a graphical representation always clearer than a written explanation? Not always, but often, especially for numbers. A good graphical representation can reveal a pattern instantly that would take several paragraphs to describe, though a bad one can also mislead just as fast. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 3. Thinking Styles. Q1. What does creative thinking actually look like when you're stuck on a problem? For me, it usually means deliberately asking a strange question. What would the opposite approach look like? Creative thinking rarely arrives from staring harder at the same angle. It comes from shifting the angle entirely. Q2. How do you practice critical thinking in everyday situations, not just at work? Mostly by pausing before accepting the first explanation that sounds plausible. Critical thinking isn't about being suspicious of everything. It's about noticing when something's being accepted just because it's convenient, not because it's actually been checked. Q3. Is it useful to think differently on purpose, even when your current approach seems to be working? Yes, occasionally, even success can hide a fragile assumption. I try to think differently on purpose every so often, just to test whether the current approach is actually the best one, or just the one that's familiar. Q4. How long do you usually think over a decision before committing to it? It depends on how reversible it is. For something small, I decide fast. For something bigger, I'll deliberately think over it overnight, because a decision that still feels right the next morning is usually more trustworthy than one made in the moment. Q5. What does your thought process look like when you're trying to solve something genuinely new? Messier than I'd like, honestly, lots of half-formed ideas before anything clicks. My thought process usually starts wide, narrows painfully slowly, and only makes sense in hindsight once I can look back at how I got there. Q6. How do you weigh up two options that both have real advantages? I try to name what I'd be giving up in each direction, not just what I'd be gaining. When you genuinely weigh up the trade-offs instead of just listing pros, the better option usually becomes clearer. Q7. What's the first step in learning to identify a problem before it becomes serious? Paying attention to small, recurring frustrations instead of dismissing them individually. You often identify a problem early simply by noticing the same minor complaint showing up more than once. Q8. When does a challenge genuinely pose a challenge worth taking seriously versus one you can ignore? When ignoring it would cost more later than addressing it now. Something that only mildly poses a challenge today can quietly grow if left unattended, so I try to catch it while it's still small. Q9. How do you decide whether a proposed solution would seem appropriate to people outside your immediate team? I try to imagine explaining it to someone with no context at all. If a solution wouldn't seem appropriate once you strip away the internal jargon and assumptions, that's usually a sign it needs rethinking. Q10. Is it healthy to strongly agree with someone just to avoid conflict, even when you have doubts? No, honestly, and I've learned that the hard way. Pretending to strongly agree when you don't just delays a disagreement that resurfaces later, usually at a worse moment than if you'd voiced it honestly the first time. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 4. Roles and Factors. Q1. What's usually the critical factor that determines whether a project succeeds or fails? Communication, more often than skill, honestly. Technical ability matters, but the critical factor I've seen separate successful projects from failed ones is almost always whether people spoke up early enough about problems. Q2. Does experience always play a critical role, or can enthusiasm make up for it? Experience plays a genuinely critical role, but enthusiasm can compensate for a while, especially early on. The danger is when enthusiasm alone carries someone past the point where experience should have kicked in. Q3. What holds a central role in how your team makes decisions? Honestly, trust holds the most central role, more than any formal process. Even a messy decision-making structure works fine if people trust each other. A clean structure fails quickly if they don't. Q4. What plays a vital role in keeping a long project from losing momentum? Visible progress, even small amounts of it. A vital role is played by simply showing people that something is moving forward, because momentum dies quietly the moment progress becomes invisible. Q5. What's the main factor that makes some meetings genuinely useful and others a waste of time? Whether a real decision needs to be made, honestly. The main factor separating a useful meeting from a wasted one is almost always whether it could have just been a written update instead. Q6. What key component of a plan do people most often overlook? The fallback option, usually. People plan the ideal path in detail, but skip the key component of what happens if that path doesn't work, and then panic when it inevitably doesn't go perfectly. Q7. What's an integral part of your process that you wouldn't want to skip, even under time pressure? A final review before sending anything out, honestly. It's become such an integral part of my process that skipping it, even once, has burned me every single time I tried to save the 10 minutes. Q8. What's an essential element of good feedback that people often get wrong? Specificity, mostly. Vague praise or vague criticism misses the essential element that actually helps someone improve. You have to point at something concrete enough that they know exactly what to repeat or change. Q9. Who is usually directly responsible for a mistake in a team setting, in your experience? It's rarely just one person, honestly, even when it feels that way in the moment. Whoever's directly responsible for the final decision usually gets the blame, but the real cause is often a chain of smaller choices upstream. Q10. What's the main task people tend to procrastinate on the longest? The one with no clear starting point, usually. The main task that keeps getting pushed back is almost never the hardest one technically, it's the one that's vaguest, because starting feels harder than the actual work would be. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 5. Impact and Consequences. Q1. How do you assess the impact of a decision before you've actually made it? I try to imagine the worst plausible outcome, not just the best one. When you genuinely assess the impact of a choice honestly, including the uncomfortable scenarios, you tend to make better decisions than if you only imagine things going well. Q2. Is it worth taking time to consider the impact of a small change, or is that overkill? For truly small changes, maybe not, but people are often bad at judging which changes are actually small. I try to consider the impact of anything that touches more than just my own work, just in case it ripples further than expected. Q3. Can one decision have an enormous impact even if it seemed minor at the time? Absolutely, and that's exactly what makes decisions dangerous to underestimate. I've seen a choice that felt like a footnote turn out to have an enormous impact months later, once its consequences compounded with other changes. Q4. What's an example of something with a major impact that most people don't notice happening? Small habitual delays, honestly. A major impact builds quietly from tiny recurring friction, a slow approval process, for example, that nobody flags individually but which collectively slows everything down. Q5. How do you recover when a decision has a clear negative impact? Own it quickly and adjust, rather than defending the original choice out of pride. A negative impact, acknowledged early, is usually far easier to fix than one that gets quietly ignored while people hope it resolves itself. Q6. What kind of change tends to have the most significant impact relative to its size? Changes to defaults. Actually, the option people get automatically if they do nothing. A tiny shift there can have a significant impact because most people never bother to change a default even when a better option exists. Q7. Do you always think through what consequences a decision might have consequences for, beyond the obvious? I try to, though I don't always succeed. Decisions have consequences that ripple outward further than the immediate, obvious ones, so I've learned to specifically ask who else might be affected before finalizing anything. Q8. What's a good way to reduce the likelihood of the same mistake happening twice? Writing it down honestly, rather than just remembering to be more careful. A clear note about what went wrong does more to reduce the likelihood of repeating it than good intentions ever have for me. Q9. What's a beneficial effect that came from a change you initially resisted? A stricter review process I fought against at first turned out to have a real beneficial effect. It slowed us down slightly, but it caught mistakes that would have been far more expensive later. Q10. Can pushing back on an idea actually create problems, even if your concerns were valid? Yes, if it's not handled carefully. Raising real concerns can still create problems if it comes across as blocking rather than improving. Timing and tone matter almost as much as the substance of the objection itself. Underscore 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 underscore. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 6. Presentations and Communication. Q1. What's the hardest part of learning to give a presentation confidently? Getting comfortable with silence, honestly, not rushing to fill every pause. The people I admire who give a presentation well seem completely at ease letting a point land quietly before moving to the next one. Q2. How do you give guidance to someone without just doing the task for them? I try to ask questions that point them toward the answer rather than handing it over directly. Real give guidance moments happen when someone works out the solution themselves, with just enough of a nudge from me. Q3. What makes a written summary genuinely useful rather than just shorter? It has to preserve the actual decision-relevant parts, not just compress word count. A good way to provide a summary is to imagine someone will only read that paragraph and act on it. Nothing important can be missing. Q4. When is it appropriate to make a recommendation versus just presenting the options neutrally? If you genuinely have relevant expertise, I think it's fair to make a recommendation clearly, while still explaining your reasoning so people can disagree if they see something you missed. Q5. How do you know when you need further information before making a call? When two people could reasonably read the same situation completely differently, that's usually my signal that I need further information before deciding anything. Q6. How do you separate relevant information from noise in a long discussion? I keep asking whether a point changes the outcome. If it doesn't, it's probably not truly relevant information, however interesting it might be on its own. Q7. What's valuable information you almost dismissed because it came from an unexpected source? A junior colleague once flagged something the rest of us had missed entirely, and it turned out to be genuinely valuable information, a good reminder that seniority doesn't guarantee who notices what. Q8. How do you politely obtain information from someone who seems reluctant to share it? I try to explain clearly why I need it, rather than just asking bluntly. People are usually much more willing to help you obtain information once they understand what it's actually for. Q9. Is it worth trying to increase awareness of a problem before you have a solution ready? Sometimes, carefully, you don't want to create anxiety with nowhere to direct it. But generally, I think it's fair to increase awareness early, as long as you're honest that a fix is still in progress. Q10. What kind of explanation is commonly used, but actually not very effective, in your opinion? Jargon-heavy summaries, honestly. They're commonly used because they sound authoritative, but they often confuse more than they clarify. A plain explanation usually serves the listener far better. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 7. Scale, Quality, and Performance. Q1. How do you judge whether a considerable amount of effort actually paid off? I compare the outcome against what would have happened with a more modest effort. Sometimes a considerable amount of work barely moves the needle, and that's an uncomfortable but important thing to notice honestly. Q2. Does the great majority of decisions in your work feel high stakes or mostly routine? Mostly routine. Honestly, the great majority are small, reversible choices. It's easy to treat every decision as important, but that just leads to exhaustion. Saving real energy for the few that truly matter works better. Q3. What's something that would greatly increase your confidence in a decision if you had it? A second, independent opinion, usually. Just one outside perspective can greatly increase how confident I feel, especially when I've been staring at the same problem long enough to lose perspective on it. Q4. Do you think people generally have high expectations of themselves, or the opposite? It varies a lot, but I've noticed a pattern where people hold high expectations for others while being surprisingly forgiving of their own shortcuts, worth watching for in yourself, honestly. Q5. What's something that holds high value even though it's easy to overlook? Clear documentation, genuinely. It holds real high value long after the excitement of a project fades, because it's the thing that saves whoever comes next from repeating your same confusion. Q6. What makes a process highly efficient without cutting corners on quality? Removing unnecessary steps rather than rushing the necessary ones. A highly efficient process isn't faster because people work harder, it's faster because there's simply less waste built into it. Q7. How do you judge the overall performance of a project, beyond just whether it was finished on time? I look at whether it actually solved the problem it was meant to, not just whether the checklist got completed. Overall performance has to include impact, not only completion. Q8. Are the economic benefits of a decision always the most important factor to weigh? No, though they matter. Economic benefits are easier to measure than things like trust or morale, which tempts people to overweight them simply because they're quantifiable, even when they're not actually the biggest factor. Q9. What's something extremely valuable that took you a long time to appreciate? Honest, uncomfortable feedback, genuinely. It felt unpleasant at the time, but looking back, it was extremely valuable, far more useful than the polite, vague feedback I used to prefer receiving. Q10. When is a relatively low amount of preparation actually enough? For low-stakes, reversible decisions, honestly, a relatively low amount of preparation is completely fine. Over-preparing for something small just wastes time you could spend on something that actually needs it. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 8. Time and change. Q1. How do you stay motivated during an extended period without visible progress? I try to shrink the time frame I'm judging myself against. An extended period without obvious results feels much less discouraging if I focus on this week's small movement instead of the entire stretch at once. Q2. What's the risk of making a big decision in a very short period? You miss information that would have surfaced with a little more patience. A short period can be enough for something simple, but rushing a complex decision usually means discovering problems only after it's too late to easily undo. Q3. How do you know when you've reached the final stage of a project versus just a pause? When what's left is polish, not substance. The final stage is usually recognizable because the core work is genuinely done. Everything remaining is refinement rather than new discovery. Q4. Can a minor change ever have effects far beyond what its size suggests? Yes, more often than people expect. A minor change to a process or a default setting can quietly ripple outward, especially once enough people rely on it without realizing how much they do. Q5. Why do you think some ideas become increasingly popular even when they're not obviously the best option? Momentum, mostly, visibility feeds on itself. Something becomes increasingly popular partly because it's already popular, which isn't always connected to whether it's actually the strongest choice available. Q6. What's something simple, like needing to fill in a form, that ends up more complicated than expected? Honestly, almost any time you have to fill in official paperwork, the instructions assume context you don't have, and what should take 5-minute stretches into an hour of confusion and second-guessing. Q7. How do you put together a plan when several people have very different priorities? I try to find the smallest shared goal everyone actually agrees on first. Once you put together a plan around that common ground, it's much easier to negotiate the remaining disagreements one at a time. Q8. How narrow should a specific area of focus be before it becomes too limiting? Narrow enough to make real progress, but not so narrow you lose sight of why it mattered. I try to define a specific area clearly, then revisit occasionally to check it's still the right one. Q9. How do you keep your primary objective in mind when a project keeps expanding in scope? I write it down somewhere visible and check back against it regularly. It's surprisingly easy to lose sight of the primary objective once a project picks up momentum and starts absorbing every adjacent idea.